want to invite you to turn to Isaiah chapter 37. We're going to read verses 14 to 29. You can follow along on the screen. Pastor Brian helpfully will tell you every Sunday what page of the Pew Bibles that's in. I have no idea. I forgot to look it up. I remembered that while we were praying, and I thought, don't think about that. Think about what we're praying about. But follow along on the screen if you would like. Isaiah chapter 37. There's a long story about these glasses, and they are coming to the end of their useful life. And I'm going to do this today. I can still see you, sort of, but I can see this better. So that's going to help. Isaiah chapter 37, beginning with verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are God, the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. And you have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the king of Assyria has laid waste all the nations in their lands and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. Then Isaiah, the son of Amoz, sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. She despises you. She scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, With my many chariots I have gone up to the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon, to cut down its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses, to come to its remotest height, to its most fruitful forest. I dug wells, and I drank waters to dry up with the sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt. Have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what I now bring to pass, that you should make fortified cities crash into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, short of strength, are dismayed and confounded and have become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like the grass on the housetops, blighted before it is grown. I know you're sitting down and you're going out and you're coming in and you're raging against me. Because you have raged against me and your complacency has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came. This is the word of the Lord. Join me in a brief word of prayer. Father, as we consider your word today, this text, the account of which it is a part, a history which is very distant from us in place and time and culture and circumstance, but which has so many reminders of just what life is like, how it poses challenges and strikes our hearts with fear, and how we are tempted to arrogance, to pride, to believing that we can run the show ourselves. Teach us, Lord, through what we read here, to recognize that you alone are God. And we thank you that you are the God of grace and mercy, who is revealed in your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Well, there are some things that cannot be appreciated in excerpts. A lot of us enjoy going to like the big box, wholesale clubs when on the weekends when they're giving out free samples of food, because you can pretty much get a meal if you plan that right. And I'll admit there are times I try something and think I'd like to have some more of that, but often it's like, okay, I don't need to have any more of that. And we discover that. We've all seen movies or seen movie trailers where we think that looks like a really good movie, and then you watch the movie and you discover every good part was in the trailer. Every single bit. Oh, that movie is so funny. Yeah, 4 times. That's the kind of thing that happens. Or, a lot of us probably feel this way about sports. Like, I don't have the patience to watch a whole game, but I will watch the highlights. Well, often, though, there's something about just being a part of the whole thing. If you only know, beef Wellington from a sample, well, you really haven't experienced it, okay? If you've only seen scenes from Casablanca, well, I pity you. You're missing something, with that. And there are some sports events where it's the sheer suspense of what's going to happen next that carries the day for us. Well, the text that we read today is kind of like this. It's a sample of a much larger body of text that stretches from Isaiah 36 to 39. Way too much for us to read at one time, but I'm going to attempt to preach on it. I hope you don't have plans this afternoon. But we'll try to do this expeditiously. This text is so good, it's in the Bible twice. It's like so nice, let's tell it twice. And so if you read 2 Kings 18:13 to 20:19, you'll find it's all of Isaiah 36 to 39 is there. Now, if you're doing the Bible read-along, you're thinking, does that mean I have to read it twice? And the answer is yes. Yes, you do. Okay, you can't fudge on that, but actually do what you like with that. So we're going to do this in 2 parts. I'm going to try to retell the story so that we have an orientation to it and then make some observations about it. So what's going on in the story? Well, we can divide it informally into 5 acts with a prologue. The prologue is just setting the scene. Hezekiah is the king of Israel, and under Hezekiah, or the king of Judah, we should say, under Hezekiah, Judah lives in perilous times. If you want to get oriented to the history of Israel in the Old Testament, it's always vital to remember Israel is geographically situated between the 2 centers of economic and political and military power in their region, Egypt and Mesopotamia. These were 2 places where in the ancient world people got rich because they had a river that could irrigate their crops, so they had a surplus of food, and out of that they built cities and amassed armies and then went out and conquered other people. As folks are wont to do. And Hezekiah is, in the history of Judah, a remarkably godly king after a couple of not-so-great kings. His great-grandfather Uzziah and his grandfather Jotham, they were okay. His father Ahaz was terrible. Just a very ungodly man. We won't go into detail about this. And later, his son Manasseh was even worse. The whole business of the transmission of faith from one generation to another is very problematic, and it's illustrated in the story of Hezekiah. But Hezekiah is an exceptionally godly king, as the kings of Judah go, so much so that he did something that very few of his predecessors or successors did, and that was eliminate the high places from Judah. Now, what are the high places? Well, when God gave Israel the tabernacle and later the temple, he said, worship here, period. Don't worship in other places. This place isn't so big you can't get here when you need to worship. So come to this one place. Well, the high places were places that people set up on their own. And the problem with them was that they were places that were very easy to, kind of combine with pagan rituals and pagan ideas and pagan worship. They were, to borrow a technical term, syncretistic. They mixed the worship of God with paganism. Well, other kings of Judah didn't want to eliminate those, maybe because they kind of liked them themselves, maybe because they were popular. And political leaders don't like to get rid of popular stuff. We're very aware of that. But Hezekiah did. And so he was exceptional in this time. But he's living in a particularly perilous point because just a couple of decades before, the northern kingdom of Israel had been overrun by the Assyrians. And so that threat against the southern kingdom of Judah, which was the one that he ruled, was always there. And so that leads us to the first act of Isaiah 36 to 39, when Rabshakeh, who is a military leader and an ace propagandist, comes to Judah and delivers a humiliating ultimatum. Now, he comes to Judah, and he's met by a delegation from the king. But he speaks loud enough that everyone can hear him, and he uses the local language, Hebrew, instead of the language of diplomacy in that region at the time, Aramaic. And at one point, the king's guys say, "Listen, could you speak in Aramaic because you're scaring our people?" And he says, "No, I'm going to speak to them in Hebrew. I want to scare your people. I want them scared." This guy is good at what he does. His message is this. First of all, he says, Egypt isn't going to help you. They always fail. And as he's coming to Judah, the Egyptians and the Assyrians had just been in battle about 20 miles to Jerusalem's west, and the Assyrians had taken Egyptian names. They had really routed them at that point, and people knew that. He then went on and said, "Your God is not going to help you either, and here's why. Hezekiah's been tearing down all of his shrines every place. He's torn down the high places." Now, I don't know whether this guy thought that was theologically significant, but he knew it was politically significant because those places were popular, and people say, "Yeah, I wish Hezekiah hadn't done that. I think I like what this guy has to say." He's just spinning a tale in a very compelling way. And then he says, "Listen, we'll do this for you. We will give you 2,000 horses if you can put riders on them." Now, this is terrific because he knows they don't have anybody who can ride a horse. In modern terms, this would be like saying, "We'll give you a whole bunch of fighter jets if you can put the pilots in them." Well, no, we can't. We've got some people who can fly Cessnas. You got any of those? You know, we would be at that point. And then he does what conquerors often want to say. "Listen, we're going to be nice to you. First of all, you know how good we are at laying siege to cities, and then people starve and they die of thirst, and there are all kinds of horrors that happen there. We won't do that. Just surrender to our tender mercies. We'll let you sit under your own vine and fig tree," which is, now he's echoing a phrase that has been used in Israel's history to describe the way that people can live in peace in the Promised Land. "We'll let you do that for a while, and then we'll take you to another place that'll be just like home, and everything will be great." So that is the tale that he has told. You know, you feel like you're listening to a political debate at this point, except I'm sorry to bring that topic up. Every circumstance, every statement that you've made has been turned against you. Well, the messengers go to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah realizes Rabshakeh isn't just mocking Judah. He's mocking God. He's mocking God. So Isaiah initially says, "Don't worry about this. The king of Assyria is going to hear a rumor. He's going to go home. He's going to be killed, and we will be left alone." And this happens even before the text, or Isaiah says this even before the text that we have read where Hezekiah prays to God. God just says, I'm going to do this. But then, Rabshakeh comes back, and he kind of doubles down on the message, and people are afraid. So, what do you do now? Hezekiah's father Ahaz, confronted with a similar situation where God said, "I'm going to deliver you," had said, "Oh, I'm not going to put God to the test," in a very pious way. What he really meant by that was, "I don't want God interfering in my plans." Well, Hezekiah does something different. We come to the second act, which is what we've just read. Hezekiah prays, and Isaiah delivers God's answer, his extensive answer. Now, what does his prayer say? Well, first he puts the letter before God, this letter that Rabshakeh has delivered. And it's like, "God, you heard this thing. This is bad stuff. Can you believe what this clown said? We know there are no gods but you. And we know that you are the good and godly God. So please show yourself to be God by delivering us the way that you have delivered us in the past." Why? So that all will know that you are God. And this is important that Hezekiah says this, because he understands the reason that God had called the people of Israel to begin with, going clear back to the patriarch Abraham, to whom God said, "I'm going to make you a great nation for this purpose, that by you all the nations of the world will be blessed." And so, Hezekiah has this profound understanding that he expresses at this point, that God has called Israel in its place and time to make everyone know, to enable everyone to know that God is the true God. And this is the nature of his prayer. It's amazing how unfocused on himself and his nation it is. It's focused on the reputation of God. And so what happens then in Isaiah's answer? Well, God says, yeah, this is about me. And I want you to know I have known about this and planned it long before. You see, and whole Bible read-along people, you're going to be kind of immersed in this for a while. There's a lot of history in the Old Testament. You're going to be reading, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and there's going to be a lot of chaos, a lot of events, a lot of stories kind of like this that are enjoyable in one way in their own terms. But there's a larger philosophy of history that's going on there. If you want a technical term for it, we call it the Deuteronomistic history. But if you just want to say, oh, it's found in the book of Deuteronomy, you're probably better off. And in Deuteronomy, way back in the time of Moses, as Moses is telling the next generation that they're about to go into the promised land, he says to them, listen, here's the deal. God gave you this land, and he gave you the terms of his covenant, the law, which you are to follow, and if you do, you will remain in the land. But if you don't follow that, if you prove unfaithful to it, well, what's the appropriate thing to do? God brought you into the land. He will take you out of the land, back to a place that is like Egypt, where you will be in captivity to a foreign power away from your home. But in that place, you will call out to God again, and he will hear you, he will answer you, and he will bring you back. Well, that scheme, that understanding, which actually is as old as the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. People are put in a good place. They're told they will have life if they obey and death if they disobey. They choose disobedience, and so they are exiled from that place of life. That scheme of history is what the prophet means when he says God has planned this from long ago. This is all, he announced this for generations. We've been living with this understanding. But here's the thing. You're going to have to wait a while, Isaiah says, for all of this to happen. It's going to have to unfold in God's timing according to God's plan. So, a third act then emerges, and God is faithful to what he has said. He delivers Jerusalem from the Assyrian siege. It's remarkable, there was a fortified city that Judah had set up called Lachish, which was off to the east, which was there to kind of protect the approach to Jerusalem. And there had been a huge siege that was there, and Lachish had fallen in the run-up to these events. This was such a big deal. The Assyrians devoted all kinds of art to it. A lot of the remains that we have of the Assyrian Empire depict the way they just brutalized Lachish, just tore into its walls and grabbed its people by the nose and carried them off in chains. A very brutal depiction of Assyrian power. Well, this is what we're expecting to happen when the Assyrians come and they lay siege to Jerusalem. But in fact, something very different happens. Something happens like the story of the Exodus under Moses when the people of Israel are enslaved by the Egyptians, and God says, listen, I will fight for you, and I will overcome all the gods of the Egyptians. And Israel doesn't even have to lift a finger in order to be liberated. God does the whole thing himself. And so that happens in this instance, and it's narrated this way in the larger text that we're considering here. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, there were all the dead bodies. Now, it's even more abrupt than that in the original language. It's more like they all woke up and they were all dead. Just that kind of paradox to the thing. Now, that sounds brutal and terrible. In the larger economy of God, Assyria is receiving there what they had delivered in other places, and there's a form of justice to it. Some people believe that this was the sudden onset of an epidemic of bubonic plague. Could be. The timing is exquisite. It's not a coincidence. And so the people of Judah understand they have been delivered from the Assyrian army, and then King Sennacherib, who has been on the march with his troops, is called back to Nineveh, his capital city, because of some problems there, and he's assassinated. So everything that Isaiah had said on behalf of the Lord has happened. So that's Act 3, but of course, you get through one crisis, you come to another. In Act 4, Hezekiah is gravely ill, and he receives the message that his life is going to be taken from him. But Hezekiah prays, and he's delivered from illness. Isaiah had said to Hezekiah in his illness, get your house in order, because you're going to die. Hezekiah prays to God, asks God to remember him. He prays in tears. And then Isaiah returns, and he says, I have a new message. God is going to deliver you, and the sign is going to be that the shadow, and this could be on a sundial or on some steps, the language is not perfectly clear to us, is actually going to move backwards. And Hezekiah is delivered from his illness and delivers a song of celebration. The essence of this song is, I live, God, to praise you. Now, at this point, I would get Hezekiah on speed dial. I would absolutely, he would be in my favorites, and I'd be calling him up. Hezekiah, here's what I'd like for you to pray for today. Please pray for the Reds in the off-season that we can get some mature talent, okay, and get more consistent, offensive production, all right? You Cubs fans, you've got your own prayers. White Sox fans, I don't want to limit the power of God, but, okay? So there we are. I would absolutely, Hezekiah is on a roll, okay? Well, that brings us to Act 5, where God warns Hezekiah of future disaster. Things are peaceable now, Hezekiah as well, and he's visited by an envoy from Babylon. What is Babylon? Well, Assyria is kind of North Mesopotamia, and Babylon is South Mesopotamia. So, I don't know, imagine somebody from Alabama, I don't know, something like that. He has come to visit. Well, Babylon, seriously, is the rising power off in that direction. Well, Hezekiah shows this man around. Would you like the tour? Let me show you the place. Certainly. He takes him everywhere, including to his treasury. And then later, the prophet Isaiah comes to Hezekiah and says, oh, well, you've shown him your stuff, and now they want it. So in the future, the Babylonians are going to come, and they're going to lay waste to the city and the temple, and they're going to take your treasury, and they're going to take your descendants captive, and that's going to be it. And it's very interesting what Hezekiah says to himself then. It's basically, at least I'll be dead then. At least I won't have to face that. Well, if we were wondering, do you think Hezekiah was the chosen one of God? The answer is no. Okay? He's not. And that may be part of the reason that Isaiah tells the story in the way that he does, so that we're still looking for the promised king whom God will send. But if we ask ourselves, well, did he just blow it? Did he make one really bad mistake? And did Judah end up in captivity because of that? The answer is no as well. Judah ends up in captivity for 100,000 reasons, all of them along the same lines. The tendency to want to run the show yourself. The inability or the inconsistency in submitting to God, in obeying the terms of his covenant. So what we really learn from Hezekiah is when those future events happen, it's not as if he could, from his celestial perch, say, oh, I had nothing to do with that. Instead, he would have to say what Isaiah had said way back in chapter 6 when he saw the glory of God. Woe to me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. None of us is in a position to say, it's everybody else's fault. I don't really participate in that. And Hezekiah shows us that kind of thing. Well, and now I'm moving into making a point of this. What is the significance of this story? Why is it told in such detail to us with this connected up narrative? Why is it included twice in the Bible? Well, I think to summarize the significance, and it only summarizes it partly, I would put it this way. The Holy One calls us to depend on him utterly. The Holy One, our God, calls on us to depend on him utterly. even the best of us is weak and fallible and evil. God alone is trustworthy. You know, unfortunately, it often takes the worst of circumstances to induce us to put our trust in God. You know, most of the time when things are going fine, we think, well, things are going fine. You know, and yeah, God, I trust you, but things are going fine. You know, and I'm making my plans, and I'm doing my stuff, and I'm going here, and I'm going there, and the shopping's done, and the grass is cut, and the kids are in bed, and all is right with the world. You know, I'm caught up on my studies, the agenda is good, midterms are coming up, I'm not afraid, everything's fine. You know, here we go, the research is in the can, the article's going to come out, we're looking great, boss is happy with my work, everything is fine. It takes a different kind of a situation for us to realize how much we need the Lord. This is where it's vital that we recognize the God of the Bible, the God who is revealed in the incarnation of the divine Son of God in Jesus of Nazareth, is the God of the weak. He calls us in our weakness. We know him best when we recognize our weakness. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Pretty good summary of who God is and who we are. God can bring his justice and mercy and blessing even to the most hopeless of situations. In Hezekiah's situation and in ours, it's easy to see everything that seems unchangeable, intractable, just stuck in the way that it is. It's easy to look back at history and around us and at the present and say, situation is hopeless. There is nowhere else we can go. It's easy to sink into despair. An interesting thing about this text at this point in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah spent about 27 chapters up to this point explaining how the world is a mess, okay? How you point at any nation and everything is falling apart. These nations may rage against God, but God ultimately will destroy their pretensions. But that isn't still the end of the story, because in Isaiah 25, he writes this beautiful passage. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all their faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It ends in a promise for weak, mortal, sinful, rebellious people that God will abolish death and wipe away their tears and invite them to a feast. So we need to trust God not to act as we would want, but to act according to his promise. Beware of those who tell you that God will give you what you want if you just pray hard enough, or if you do it in the right way, or believe hard enough. That's not why he's acting here, and that's not what he does. Hezekiah and Judah knew that they had a mission if they were listening. The mission was to make God known to the nations, to these nations that had made such chaos of the world. And they knew that God never brought victory by the means that other people think victory comes. He doesn't operate like the kingdoms of the world, like the Egyptians, like the Assyrians, like the Babylonians, like the armies of Alexander the Great later, like the Persians, like the Romans, like any of those ancient or modern empires. No, he operates in weakness to demonstrate his strength. He works through people like Abraham, through events like the Exodus and Israel's conquest, through the judges, who are quite an interesting bunch of misfits as military leaders, through people like David, a middle school kid with a sling. And we know what middle school kids are like. This is the way God operates. He operates through an old, sick king like Hezekiah. And they understood that if disaster came, it was for Israel because they failed to remember and to trust and submit. And so it was a reminder of that submission. Now, you and I are in a slightly different place than Israel. Okay, Moses had said to Israel, listen, if disaster comes, it's because you haven't been listening. Okay, in the larger context of the Bible, though, it's not, oh, disaster came because I did something wrong. No, disaster just comes. It's kind of baked into the cake. It hits all of us. You know, all of us are weak, all of us are mortal, all of us are subject to the vicissitudes of life as we are alienated from the tree of life that God provides. But in those situations, why is this happening? Well, there's a kind of inscrutable randomness to it. Nevertheless, every one of those occasions is a reminder where our real strength, our real object of trust lies. It is with God. If we suffer as the Lord warned us we would, it is on the way to glory, His glory and our resurrection glory. His strength is made perfect, not in our cleverness or hard work or stubborn, defiant anything, but in our weakness. Now, could God be trusted even later for Israel? When they were in exile, when Jerusalem had fallen, when there was no temple, there was no king? Yes. Yes, He could. Must that mean a temple, a city, and a king, as they had been known? Well, Jesus will show us no. Jesus will say, I am the real temple, I am the real king, and my enthronement is my crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus is showing us that His global people are His temple as the Spirit lives in Him, as we give witness to the God who is making Himself known through Jesus to the nations. As His community of love, we are testifying to the risen King who is greater in His lowliness than any political and military ruler can be. So in this, God remains trustworthy even when we trust poorly. Hezekiah and Jerusalem were not delivered because they prayed better. They were delivered because God is good. The eventual Babylonian exile didn't happen because Hezekiah messed up once. It happens for a whole host of reasons, but God remains faithful even in that situation. Any notion of prayer or trust or things that if done right will yield our preferred result is blasphemous. That's not trust. That's trying to get God to do what we want. If we need a reminder of that, let's remember how God says He's going to deliver Jerusalem even before Hezekiah prays. Any notion of trust that anoints a Messiah other than Jesus is poor trust. It's blasphemous trust. This memory of God's deliverance, too, we need to remember, can ironically erode our genuine trust. You know, the story of the deliverance of Jerusalem from Assyria was a deep part of Israel's memory in generations to come. And if we go forward about a century to the time of the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, you know, we have a terrible problem here. You think that God will never let Jerusalem fall. You think it's because His temple is here and He'll always preserve it. And Jeremiah says, this isn't His temple anymore. You've taken His temple and turned it into a den of rebels. And so God says, I'm going to take it away to tell you who I truly am. Let's never think that because God has manifested His presence with us in the past, that He will always manifest His presence with us in the same way. Instead, let's recognize that true trust is with God irrespective of the circumstances, knowing that God is far more wise and far more powerful than we, and His perspective is so much longer. It is eternal. You know, it's interesting that the key word that God gives to Israel in its Passover feast when they celebrated deliverance from Egypt was remember. It's interesting that at the Last Supper, at the Passover, that Jesus uses the word remember to say the same kind of thing. Remember my death. Remember who I am. This is how God is delivering you. If we remember well, we remember in our weakness, in our humility, recognizing that God's strength is demonstrated in that similar kind of weakness. So as we move forward in trust, in the mystery of faith that anticipates all kinds of eventualities, but ultimately says, God, you are in control, that copes with good news, with bad news, with distressing news, with the reminders of our own mortality, with what seemed to be the end of dreams that we have held, we recognize that God has something greater and better for us, but he calls on us to trust.